Should Kevin Durant sit for the final 4 games of the season? Does Steve Nash take the blame for these struggles late in the year? And does anyone have any idea what Ben Simmons is going to do? It's all coming up right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I am Adam Armbrecht, also covering the New York Football Giants over on the One Giant podcast with my boy Andy Mack. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms. And let you know, today's episode is brought to you by Bet Online. Bet Online has you covered all season long with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. Bet Online, it's where the game starts. And where we start is in the most important decision that the Brooklyn Nets may make for this entire season. We know, obviously, that they had the disappointing loss on Saturday night, 122-115 on the road to the Atlanta Hawks. There's the ramifications around the standings. And off of that, the big question becomes, should Brooklyn be sitting down Kevin Durant for the last 4 games? I contend that they should. I contend that not only should they be sitting down Kevin Durant, they should also be sitting down Seth Curry, waiting comfortably and sitting down Bruce Brown, and certainly waiting to see what the timeline looks like for Dragic to come out of protocols. Obviously, he's not injury-based, but it still has a big impact. And let's lay out the picture why. Because when you go over off of this loss, which was disappointing, we're going to talk about that game. We're going to talk about Kevin Durant's monster career-high 55-point performance. But the biggest proponent that came out of that game, when you look over at the standings, is the path that it lays out ahead for the Brooklyn Nets to get out of that 10th seed. That's where they currently sit in a tie with Charlotte. Obviously, the tiebreaker going to Charlotte. So they're 10th. You have Charlotte 9th, also 40-38. 1 game up on them is Atlanta at 41-37. And then off in the distance there, 43-35 are the Cleveland Cavaliers, who the Brooklyn Nets we know will see on the second to last game of the season. Now, when we look at those standings and we think about the 4 remaining games, if you told me that Seth Curry was 100% healthy and Bruce Brown was 100% healthy and Dragic wasn't in protocols, then yes, I want every single game that I can possibly get, and I want to make that push to get myself as high as I can to that 8th seed out of the situation that Brooklyn is right now, where they need to win 2 games in order to get into the playoffs, as opposed to, as we know, as the 7th or 8th seed, not that the Nets are going to get there, but being able to have 2 games to win 1. The first thing we do is take a look at the schedule for the teams ahead of Brooklyn. Right up in front of them is going to be Charlotte, Miami, Orlando, Chicago, and Washington are their 4 remaining games. If we set a modest expectation that they'll go 2-2, looking at Orlando and Washington, certainly, regardless of what should be a very exciting game against Chicago and a difficult matchup first and foremost against Miami. If they go 2-2, Brooklyn then has to go 3-1 to get ahead of them because of the tiebreaker. We then take a look up the board at Atlanta. Atlanta sets up to take on Toronto, Washington, Miami, which could be a less significant game depending on how things play out for them over their next couple of matchups, followed by Houston. Set again the modest expectation of 2-2. If they accomplish that, now Brooklyn's going to have to go 4-0 over their final 4 games in order to get over top of Atlanta, because just 2 more wins gets them to 43, and the only way the Nets are getting there is to have 44 wins. Last but not least, Cleveland, if we just want to include the what-if scenario, we know they've been dealing with injuries. They would need to go 1-3 over their final 4 games, head-to-head, obviously, against Brooklyn, but then Philadelphia, Orlando, the Brooklyn Nets, and the Milwaukee Bucks. By the final game of the season, will that matter for Milwaukee? Wait and see on that. But again, Orlando in there, and then obviously Philadelphia. Those are difficult matchups. Very reasonable to say that Cleveland could go 1-3 over their final 4 games. That game is underway right now as we record this on Sunday against Philadelphia. But that means, again, Brooklyn will have the tiebreaker against them. And at 1-3, getting them to 44 wins, Brooklyn will need to go 4-0. So the worst case scenario that the Nets could afford here to make any real headway within reason is to say that they need to go 3-1 over these final 4 games. And again, if you told me they were 100% healthy, I would be all for continuing that push, but they're not. You have Seth Curry, who's been dealing with the ankle injury. We've now known this for a couple of weeks that it's something he's been dealing with and he's going to have to continue to deal with. I want 4 games of rest for Seth Curry on top of the ones that he's already got. He should not step out onto the court. Bruce Brown landed, as we know, right on that shoulder, elbow, arm, wrist area. Now, within reason, if he's ready to go out there, sure, I'm not worried about minutes when it comes to Bruce Brown. But if we're talking about being 90%, 85% versus 100%, sit him down. He doesn't need to be out there. Dragic is just in protocols. So when he's ready to go, great, he's ready to go. But if I'm sitting here right now and looking at the possibility of Nets can't go any lower than 10th, they are locked in. They're not going to fall beyond that. It's impossible. So do I want to have an 80% healthy roster that tries to push here over these final 4 games to maybe get to the 9th seed and be at home, or maybe get to the 8th seed and have the 2-for-1? Or do I want to have 100% health behind Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving to say, we will take our chances having to, as it stands right now, play Charlotte, win that game, and then sit there and wait to see who's it going to be? Atlanta beats Cleveland. We'll take Cleveland on the road. Fine. If it's the other way around, listen, we just came out of a game where you didn't have those 3 players that we're talking about, and the Brooklyn Nets were in that game. Took a 55-point performance from Kevin Durant, but they were in that game. Understanding anything can happen. One and done is a very dangerous place to be in. But if I look at the schedule right now and I look at what the opportunity is here, would I rather save 160 minutes off of Kevin Durant here over these final 4 games and give him as much rest as possible? Yes, I would. Because there is nothing over the course of his career, let alone this season, that suggests that Kevin Durant could take 6 months off from basketball and immediately walk back out there and start dropping buckets. He just had a career high game. We know that he gets anywhere on the court that he wants to, that he gets his looks, he gets his shots, and that everybody benefits off of him. Go back and look at the playoffs last year. Different roster, different set of circumstances, but Kevin Durant found himself out there with injuries piling up around him, trying to do the Herculean lift. We already know that at a minimum, the Nets are going to have to play one more extra game just to get themselves into the 8th seed and give themselves, or 7th seed potentially if they got that high, and get themselves into a matchup with, as it stands right now, the Miami Heat. So do I think it's worth it to take these next 4 games and guarantee that Kevin Durant gets as much rest as possible, to guarantee that Seth Curry is as close to full strength as possible, and Bruce Brown, and get Dragic, rather than play it out? The Nets could play all 4 of these games. Kevin Durant could go 55 points over 42 minutes every single game for the last 4 games, and they could still go 2-2 and be in the exact same position that they are right now. And I'll even extend it a little bit further, because when you look at this roster right now, you would say not only the players that we're mentioning here, and Kyrie Irving's a little bit of an in-between. Shout out to a big listener of the show, as we know, Hassan, who mentioned, as we talked about last season at this time of the year, this is going to be a time. This is going to be Ramadan for Kyrie Irving. We know there's going to be fasting, so that could have a fatigue impact on him, but he's still in this in-between area of trying to ramp himself up, to build himself up to playing every single game. We know that it didn't take a lot for him to get back into rhythm, but now playing home and away games all the way through. Steve Nash mentioned it. We'll talk about it here in a minute. The effect that that maybe is having on Kyrie as he tries to ramp himself back up, and just understanding the results are going to be the results. Like, we're going to have to deal with whatever that curve looks like. But I'll flex him through. I'll run him out there for the first half of a game over the last 4, but not put him out there for the full 40 minutes or 44 like he did in this last contest. He's been struggling. He's been trying to find his shot. Okay. Again, I'm not worried about Kyrie being able to come out and play at a high level. Maybe him taking a step back wouldn't be the worst thing either. And I'll even extend it a little bit further. A guy like Patty Mills, shut him down. He's been having a miserable time. He can't find his shot. We already know he's played more minutes this season than he ever has in his career. Give him 4 straight games off. Whatever he's going to give to you, let him be as fresh as humanly possible to do so. And over the back end of this season now, I'll run out all the guys that I know I can. I'll run out Day'Ron Sharp. I'll run out LMA if he's healthy and it looks like he's going to be buried come playoff time. I'll run out Cam Thomas. I'll run out Kessler Edwards, David Duke Jr. I'll let JJ keep running. I'll get Blake back out on the floor. I don't care what the results are. I'll bring up whoever I can, whatever it takes. The smartest path is to have this team as healthy as possible, walk into that 10th seed, one and potentially done situation, and trust that you can beat Charlotte, that Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving and a healthy supporting cast can blow that team out of the water and then live with that next situation where you have to take on Atlanta or Cleveland. This, to me, is the path forward here for the Brooklyn Nets in what has been an absolutely insane season. It's been up and down and injuries and in and outs and the bad luck and all of the circumstances. Now is an opportunity for the Nets to make what could be a difficult decision, but I think ultimately the right one to give themselves the best chance for success to get out of that play-in process into the playoff scenario, and then away you go. But there's a lot of people here that could stand to have some rest. And if some of these injuries could use some more time, why sacrifice Kevin Durant out there over the Final Four when you know you're going to need 48 full every single night once the play-in game and playoffs ultimately start? We're going to talk about the big performance from Kevin Durant here, what it told us about him and his game. Turns out he's really good. And of course, the post-game comments from both Kevin Durant and Steve Nash that I think really does show how the head coach and your biggest, best star are on the same page when it comes to what's not going so well right now for Brooklyn and what they're trying to iron out. And again, maybe why it's worth taking that little step away. But before we do, got to tell you about our friends over at Built Bar. You know, we talk about them. You know, Kevin Durant's going to need one. It's that protein boost combined with 100% covered in real chocolate protein bar that avoids all those nasty things we don't like from candy bars. That's because while candy bars can hit you with 30 grams of sugar and over 240 calories, when you pick up a Built Bar, you're going to get just 130 calories, only 4 grams of sugar, just 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. And beyond the Built Bars themselves, there's also the first of their kind protein-infused puffs, which are a marshmallow. Delicious. Also covered in 100% real chocolate, also packed with protein without giving you any of those nasty additives from mint brownie, coconut almond, and all the delicious flavors. If you can think of a flavor that you think would taste good, guarantee you Built Bar is producing it because that's what they're about. You head over to built.com right now and use promo code LOCK15 and you'll get 15% off on your order. That's promo code LOCKed15 for 15% off over at built.com. So then there is, coming off of this game, the performance that was Kevin Durant. This is career high, Kevin Durant. This is almost 68% from the field, Kevin Durant, over 42 minutes. This is 8 of 10 from beyond the arc for 80%. Career high 8 made 3-pointers from Kevin Durant. And it's also 9 of 11 from the free throw line if you want to add those in. It was incredible. It was epic. It was everything you wanted it to be and more from Kevin Durant, further cementing the idea that this is a guy who gets where he wants to go, gets his looks, and is Mr. Automatic. There was even the point where on a Kyrie dish from driving the lane, kicks to the left corner, Kevin Durant caught the ball above his head and went straight up with the shot, nothing but net, corner 3. He obviously is unstoppable. He obviously is incredible. This marks the second time this season. Now his third highest scoring effort came last month against the New York Knicks with a 53-point performance. We know that this is what this guy is about. Sandwiched in between there, OKC against Golden State Warriors back in 2014, where he went for 54, 53, 54, 54. We'll check the math on that. Everything about his performance was incredible. Everything about it cements who he is in the game today. On the national broadcast, I can't remember who the commentator was who said, listen, blasphemy if you want it, but Kevin Durant, like Michael Jordan, is a guy that when he wants to get his score, when he wants to get his bucket, that's what he's going to do. And I think, that comparison just in the vein of, unlike a Giannis where the game has evolved to, I'm not diminishing this, but Giannis can go downhill and attack in a different way, right? These are players, Kevin Durant, even like maybe LeBron James, you want to say in the latter stages, but the Michael Jordans of the world. These are guys that just go to where they want on the floor. It's like the defense isn't there. When they're locked in, it is an unstoppable force. So we knew that. We know that. The other funny thing, if you want to frame it that way, about this game is just that the Brooklyn Nets also, this felt like a microcosm of their season. Absolutely epic performances from Kyrie Irving. We've seen them from Kevin Durant. We saw some from James Harden once upon a time when he was still a net. And yet encapsulated inside of a loss, encapsulated inside of a game where the Brooklyn Nets had some foul trouble, had some defensive issues, had lapses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and they lose a game. And just like the one prior where you lose a tight one to the Milwaukee Bucks, it's this both and. That was an incredible playoff level atmosphere intensity, and also a game that you kind of absolutely needed to win because there aren't any of these sacrifice games. And you go back over the course of this season, by the way, there was a couple of things that I made a note of here, and we're going to talk about the post game comments from Kevin Durant and also from Steve Nash. But the first thing was just to encapsulate this a little bit. We talked about how the Nets have lost some bad games over the course of the season. Just interestingly enough, against non-playoff or play-in game teams in the Eastern Conference, the Brooklyn Nets have gone 13-2 against the East in those games. 3-5 against non-play-in or playoff teams in the West. So they're 16-7 against the bad teams, quote unquote, in the league, teams that are not a part of the play-in or playoff scenario, which does make them 24-31 overall against the play-in or better teams. With everything that's gone on, right? You start the season out, it's the Joe Harris injury. It's no Kyrie Irving. What's going to happen there? It's a little bit, couple of injuries here for some other players, minor ones. Kevin Durant in and out. The turmoil of James Harden, the trade, bringing these pieces back in, getting the buyout market Dragic. Like everything has just felt like up and down, in and out, and in moments where you think something special is happening, like that performance from Kevin Durant, it gets watered down and diluted inside of the fact that you lost a pivotal game to the Atlanta Hawks, that you've brought yourself down to the 10th seed, and further supported the idea that maybe they should put some rest for these players here ahead of that playoff push. Now, on top of which, we said the post game comments that came out of this one, I'll just encapsulate Steve Nash, who essentially said things that he's mentioned before as far as the defensive intensity, what they need to be doing more and better of in these games. He said at some point, it's on the players to make that commitment, to be dialed in on that end of the floor. Now, again, you're missing a lot of the key pieces in this one and representative inside of this game. Dragic, the length there. We know Bruce Brown's been doing it on both ends, and then the pure offensive side of Seth Curry. But essentially, we didn't play a good ball game. That's what Nash said. Can't really sugarcoat it. Like, that's just the bottom line. Now, beyond that, though, and I know that there's been so much conversation around what does Steve Nash do in game adjustments. In this particular one, I think it's really hard to talk about rotations and Claxton and Andre Drummond, Cam Thomas, Kessler Edwards, JJ, all that stuff. And we're going to get to it later in the week. We'll certainly talk about that as we build towards the playoffs. But I did find it interesting, though, that then when you go inside of the Kevin Durant conversation in the post game, this is where his mind went. First off, on his game alone, my shots are going to come. My points are going to come. I just been mentally preparing, open-minded about how I'll approach the game, how other teams are going to approach defending me, and being ready to go out there and execute on a game-to-game basis. But he understands that he's going to get his. That's the apex predator alpha mentality. But when it came to this game in particular, undisciplined, reaching in the bonus early every quarter, having guys bottled up, and then if you're on YouTube, the visual of slapping down late in sequences as they drove towards the basket, giving them looks at the line, giving them and one opportunities. Just bad basketball after good defense and then giving up fouls like that. It's just unacceptable at this point of the season. And the reason why I label this kind of as on the same page. is because these are the things that don't matter about who's rotating in and who's playing the minutes, because we've seen this across the board, and nobody is a bigger fan of certain players and the younger guys and seeing these rotations get some opportunities here. But this is a team thing. This is a full effort opportunity for the Brooklyn Nets to do better and to look better. And again, when we talk about guys that should get better minute shares or bigger minute shares, I think that this is also the reality when you don't have a Bruce Brown or a Dragic or a Curry. You start to see this team gets very thin very quickly because none of these guys can be relied on with consistency. Do I think that there are some players that could give you a spark potentially? Yes, I do. And Doug and I are going to have a conversation about a couple of key players later in the week that I think are deserving of bigger opportunities. And yet, as Kevin Durant alluded to, when you go inside the box score of this game, it comes down to a simple philosophy and mentality. And this isn't X's and O's. This isn't something you can put on Steve Nash. Steve Nash can't give the effort or give the focus or give that edge to players on this end of the court. And it's because inside of this game, again, 37-41 on 3-point attempts. Nets destroyed them 46 to 32% from beyond the arc. The free throws, 30 fouls in the first half for the Brooklyn Nets. 49 trips to the line, 30 fouls, but 30 attempts in the first half, 19 in the second half for 49 total from the line. The rebounds are 52-54. It's even money there. The steals, big number there, 10 for Atlanta in this game, active hands. The turnovers were 13-7. It's not great. It's not 13 isn't ideal, but it's not terrible. Points in the paint, 36 apiece, dead even. Fast break points, 15-12 in favor of Brooklyn. Points off turnovers, 15-12 in favor of Brooklyn. So when you look inside these numbers, let alone a category we talked about a lot on this podcast, the shot attempts. The Nets had 13 more shot attempts than the Atlanta Hawks in this game. 13 more opportunities, and you couldn't get it done and outshot them from the field, 42 to 41.9, basically even percentages from the field. But when you send guys to the foul line, and I know we heard about it in the post game off the Milwaukee loss, there were 7 fouls that were clearly not correct, and that would have brought that number down, and things could have looked a little bit different. But you're hearing Steve Nash say it. You're hearing him communicate frustration around something that he specifically believes is something that needs to be taken care of by the players on the court, and Kevin Durant is echoing that sentiment. So when I hear those two things, for whatever we think about some of the little adjustments, et cetera, this is the roster you're going forward with. These are probably the rotations you're going forward with. And it just comes down to whether or not you can have that mentality. And I wonder if, to circle it back around, if some days off for these key players that need the rest for injury or otherwise, and some key figures that maybe could just use the practice reps and dialing in that mentality before they get back out there for what will be some of the critical games. But I see this as head coach and superstar being on the same page about what's not working right now. Got to clean it up. That's the bottom line as far as that goes. And we'll see if some of these players can make that adjustment as we look towards the playoffs. That being the case, let's talk about Ben Simmons. The conflicting reports, even from inside of one single media outlet, and why nobody knows for sure if, when, ever Ben Simmons will step on the court this season, this postseason, to help Brooklyn for this run ultimately. But before we do, got to tell you, of course, about our friends over at Bet Online. That's because Bet Online is your number one source for all your betting needs and sports info. You can find all the latest sports developments, including this week's Masters Championship odds, podcast, and reviews for all the different leagues this season. I was over there trying to buoy my spirits, recording on Sunday here, obviously. I'm going to take that Cleveland. I'm going to take Philadelphia, lay in 4 against Cleveland because I need Cleveland to lose. Always bet with your heart, never with your head, as I like to say. We'll check back in and see if that came to fruition for me. But as we know, you head over to the website or your mobile device to learn more about all the trends and action, where BetOnline continues to be your source for all your sport wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores and highlights. You got to, of course, get over to BetOnline where the game starts. So the last piece of information, Doug and I talked about this before, when we think about Ben Simmons And if when he may come back to play here, it could be for the play-in game, could be 2 games before the season ends, could be in the first round of the playoffs if Brooklyn can get there. I know we said we're not doing the speculation piece on it per se, but what we are doing, or what I'm going to do, is highlight that this past Friday, all underneath the Athletic, basically from the morning into the afternoon, there were 3 different reports that came out, and we'll even go ahead and square it up with a little bit from Andre Drummond. Friday morning, Joe Varden wrote that Ben Simmons is not close to returning and will not be ready for the playoffs. So there you go. Done deal. He's not coming back. He's not going to be ready for the playoffs. Maybe you could see him sometime if he can get there. Then in the afternoon, Sham Charania, who's plugged in. None of this is, by the way, casting dispersions on any of these reporters, but he reported that Ben Simmons is right on course. He's resumed his on-court workouts, and hope remains that he will be able to ramp up for the playoffs, and will help to make for an even deeper run for the Brooklyn Nets. Alex Schiffer, even later, all for The Athletic, came out and said the calendar continues to work against the Nets, and it's not in the Brooklyn Nets' nature, to bring him back, Ben Simmons, unless the performance staff fully clears him. So you've got 3 narratives there that's different degrees, and you can pick out certain words like the hope remains or the calendar works against them. It's not all terribly specific, but different degrees of what they think is possible or likely versus when real expectations timetables should be set. In addition, Andre Drummond, who was asked, this is going back into last week, saying, in terms of what he's doing, none of us know. He's the mystery guy, Ben Simmons, that is. He comes in sweats every day, and God knows what he does after that. So hopefully he's doing this recovery, and he's getting better each and every day. When we get him back, we get him back. Now, some components of that you can look at and say, well, that's the part of the Brooklyn Nets, obviously a part of, never giving anything away, always playing it close to the vest. That's fine. The Brooklyn Nets never give you honest timelines. A lot of teams don't, but the Nets have seemingly been notorious around that. But you have players, and you probably treat that maybe the least earnest, because Drummond would have every reason to say, who knows? Maybe we'll never see him again. And then to have him strut out there. But when you have reporters inside of the same organization, all with as much information as they could possibly find, coming with different speculative ideas or concepts around when Ben Simmons could return, you can't put any stock in any of it. Now, do I think inside of all of this, the things that I look at are when Sham Charania, who maybe has the most positive outlook, also includes the hope remains. Okay. But the hope remained that Joe Harris was going to work his way back from injury, and then he ended up having to get a second surgery and had to shut himself down, right? So you can frame something inside of the hope remains that this is a possibility, when ultimately the likelihood is that he will not be available. This brings us back around to obviously the top of the show, the theme that has been the Brooklyn Nets ever since they went down the path of bringing in the superstars Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving and James Harden, and then no James Harden, and now Ben Simmons. It's just the bad luck seems to befall them. Now, I had speculated when they made this trade that it was much about the future as it was about the present moment. I think that they went in with the open eyes around that. Now, the question becomes, as Doug and I have said, can you walk Ben Simmons into a play-in game and say, we need you for a big spot here? I don't think that that's viable. I think the more likely, if there is any timetable here, would be to say, we're going to live with the results from the play-in game. And then if we make it through that, we'll see where things are and if it's possible to insert him in. But it's not unlike last year when you think about James Harden and coming back from his injury. You're going to at least get to a point where you feel like the upside benefit is worth the risk. Now, I don't know how dealing with a back injury like he is and a herniated disc. I just flat out do not know how, if you're the Brooklyn Nets, you can approach this as, let's test the ankle and see if you can go out there for a few minutes. You could either, one, have him just not be effective and be a detriment. That's maybe low level risk. But what if you re-aggravate something? Whatever the big picture plan is in the offseason for the Brooklyn Nets, can you risk running out Ben Simmons for the possibility of, as opposed to living with the results and saying, until we have 100% clearance on Ben Simmons, it's 0% clearance. That's where I think the Brooklyn Nets are living right now when it comes to Ben Simmons. And all we can do ultimately is wait. Some interesting games to watch. Obviously, as we said, Cleveland leading over Philadelphia at halftime at the time of this recording. We also will see how that one shakes out. Toronto just getting underway. Everything else that's happening across the board there will be covered by one Doug Norrie, who should have, fingers crossed, a really exciting guest come Tuesday. Then we'll get back in on the post game following Houston, obviously. So be sure to head over to YouTube, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button. We, as always, appreciate all of the support, the conversation, the getting into it. Mix it up. As long as it's respectful, man, you can disagree with me. You can disagree with Doug. Let me know how you feeling. Sit down, Kevin Durant, and a lot of guys. Get in on the conversation over there. Get the podcast review, get those needs fulfilled. And as we've been saying, let's stay focused on Nets, present and former. I like to smile, even in intense situations. My opponents don't know how to react when they see me smile. Vinsanity, Vince Carter, one of the all-time great American NBA basketball poets. We'll be back again next time talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball.